me to introduce Rabbi and Schusterman, who I've gotten to know virtually over the past few months, and just today we met in person for the first time. Rabbi Schusterman has written a very, very important work called Why God Why? How to Believe in Heaven When It Hurts Like Hell. He wrote this book after being already a seasoned and veteran mechanich who had dealt with many of the difficult questions of machshava, and then he himself, as I'm sure he'll share, had a trauma in his family, and it caused him to grapple with this question and inspired him to be able to help others as they go through trauma and tragedy in their lives. And it's a great scoop to be able to welcome Rabbi Schusterman here to the OU Israel Center.
Thank you, Reb Shmuel, and thank you, the OU, for hosting this. I used to work for the OU. About 15 years ago, there was a period that I was a mashgiach. And I don't know if you know Rabbi Nathanson in Los Angeles. He's the head of the West Coast kashrus for the OU. So we have a relationship for many years. I get the Jewish Action probably for the last 25 years. I actually had an article in the Jewish Action in 1977, would you believe it?
Wow.
Okay, but the subject tonight is my book. And I'll begin with the question that a lot of people ask, why did you write this book? And I'll tell you the truth. The genesis of this book started in 1986 on April 4th. It was a Sunday in Southern California. I was then the director, is that okay? Too much? I was then the director of the Hebrew Academy, which was founded in 1968. 1986, it was a seasoned school with well over 300 students, a large staff, and it required full-time maintenance, and as the director, full-time fundraising. My wife, then, may she rest in peace, we had been there since 1971. She had been teaching for 16 years in the early elementary grades, the third grade, the fourth grade, the second grade, and if you have 20 to 25 kids in your class each year, so 16 times 25, that average 22 and a half kids a year. She had relationships with hundreds of families who their kids went through her classes. April 4th was 10 days before Pesach. Anybody who makes Pesach, it's around then that the pre-Pesach anxiety sets in. All the plans have to be put into place. And many schools throughout the United States have a pre-Pesach program for the early elementary kids where the kids can go in and perform, show that they know Manishtana and they know some of the things about the Haggadah, and the parents come and kvel, and they sing some songs from the Haggadah. And my wife was also a pianist, so she came in to play the piano for those programs. She did mention to one of her friends, which I found out later, she did mention during the performance that she's really not feeling well, but she's going to have to stick it out until the end, which she did. I was in Los Angeles giving the class there, and on my way back, I got a call on my phone from her saying she's really not feeling well, she must see a doctor, and I should hurry back, lest I be accused, as I have been accused, of you can't talk about a cell phone in 1986, they didn't exist. Okay, it wasn't a cell phone, it was an attaché case phone, because if you remember the first generation of cell phones, the battery was an attaché case. The phone was bigger than today's cell phones. Okay, but that's how she was able to call me while I was driving back in my car. I rushed home. I got into my house. I was greeted by my 12-year-old son, who was the next to the oldest of the children. The oldest was learning in yeshiva in New York. And he said, "Mommy's in bed. She wants to see you." I went to her, and it didn't take more than a few seconds of diagnoses to realize she really needs to see a doctor. She put on her robe and rushed out to the car, rushed to the closest hospital, which was 2 miles away. She passed out in the car. They took her straight into the emergency room. They told me, "You stay here. We'll be back in a while to report on her." And I did what any good Lubavitcher Chassid would do. First thing I did was call the Rebbe's office, and the Rebbe knew who my wife was. He knew her family, even back, as far back as Europe, and told the secretary, who was my brother-in-law, Rabbi Benjamin Klein, had the good fortune of working for the Rebbe from the age of mid-20s until Tafshin and Daled. So he said he'll go right into the Rebbe and tell him. And I sat down in the waiting room to say Tillim. About 45 minutes later, the doctor came out with a very somber look on his face and said, that sentence that you really don't want to hear, "Rabbi, we did everything that we could, but your wife didn't make it." I was 38, she was 36, and we were observant Jews. We took the halacha seriously, and we had, in our 17 years of marriage, 11 children, the last being twins, who were at that point 16 months old. So, one thing I want to say is, I never gave up faith and trust in Hashem. The first thoughts that went through my mind was, I made a quick analysis and said, life as you've known it until this moment has changed forever. The next thing was, I don't know why this is happening, but one thing I'm sure, that this is not a fluke, it's not a chance occurrence, it's not bad luck, it's from Hashem. Why? I still have I didn't have an answer then, and I don't have an answer now either. But I just settled on the fact this is from Hashem for a purpose. And I settled it at that. Then I said, my challenge now is to see if everything that I learned, and everything that I believe in, and everything that I've taught others, and everything that I've preached to others, if I can keep up with that and take it in today too. That was my challenge. And then I had to deal with the reality in front of me. I'm not going to go into all the details, but funerals and children that need supervision, and who is going to go to the funeral, which is going to be in New York, and the next, at various levels of, the next few weeks flew by with 1,000,001 things that had to be attended to, including making Pesach. My wife's mother and sister and brother-in-law joined us for Pesach and helped out and kept some stability in the home, but after Pesach they had to leave. And I had a school with 350 kids, and while I toyed with the idea of saying, putting up a little sign, Rabbi Schusterman is not feeling well today. Take a number, and when he's back, he'll give you a call. But I couldn't do that, obviously. So I had to deal with what I had to deal with in front of me. I paid a price for that, because in a normal Shiva, the people who come to the house of Shiva are the comforters, the consolers, and the people sitting on the low benches, they are the ones to be consoled. But many of the people that came to our Shiva were parents in the Hebrew Academy, who were wonderful American Jews, not that well steeped in Jewish knowledge, or even, for some, Jewish tradition. And they had a question: why did this happen? How could it happen? 11 orphans? The Rebbitzin? The Rabbi? They had no words. I couldn't give them long lectures as people were sitting around a Shiva setting. But that's how I spent much of my Shiva, talking to the people and explaining to them, and trying to comfort them. Because this was necessary, we were there to teach children, but to educate the families as well. So in July of that year, April, May, June, in July, I gave a lecture series on why bad things happen to good people. Those of you who are beyond a certain age, remember the book from a conservative Rabbi, Harold Kushner, by that very name, which came out in 1981. It was a bestseller, and I had, as a rabbi, I skimmed the book before and came to the conclusion that while it is an interesting book, it is not a religious book and not a Jewish book. Interesting as it might have been, because it was a book, the thesis of the book, Rabbi Kushner himself and his wife had a young son who at the age of 3 was diagnosed with a very rare disease called progeria, which is early aging. And by the time he reached the age of 10, he looked like a mini senior citizen. And they told him that he was not going to live through adolescence, and he passed away a few days after his 14th birthday. So they had a peckle of their own, without a doubt. And in Rabbi Kushner's effort to process it, he wrote that book, and he said, don't blame God. There's pockets of evil in the world that even God doesn't control. So God is sympathetic to you. You can lean on him, but don't blame him, because he didn't have the power to stop it. To me, and to many people I've spoken to, didn't find it comforting, because that means that nothing is real and nothing is permanent, nothing is secure. Even you can't really count on God. Eov, when his wife told him, after he was hit by the second onslaught of challenges that Hashem authorized the Satan to afflict him with, his wife said to him, Eov, Baruch Elokim Vamus, blaspheme and drop dead. Those are the very words. She didn't say it in English, but those are the words, Baruch Elokim Vamus. And he told her that you speak like a impious woman. Impious is an interesting word, but that's, shall we accept the good from God and not the bad? That's what Eov said to his wife. In other words, even Eov said, we thanked God for the good, we have to accept the bad. if you don't accept the bad, then take thank God out of your lexicon, because there's nothing, God can't be responsible, can't be not responsible for the bad, but he is responsible for the good. It doesn't work halfway. At that point, I needed some support. Knowing the answers that it says in the Mishnah and in the Gemara and in Chassidus and in Ashkafa is wonderful for the mind. But people are not just minds, they're also hearts. And the heart wants more. And not getting it, I looked for something in Jewish writing. It didn't find too much that speaks to the person personally, rather than many good books quoting the appropriate sources, little that actually spoke to the person. All right, so I went out to find a therapist. I found a therapist. I asked a friend who was a therapist, find me someone who themselves lost a spouse and raised children themselves, and they will understand me. And I found a wonderful, retired, older Jewish woman who lived in, we lived in Long Beach. This was Los Angeles. She lived in Los Angeles. Then it was only a half an hour drive away. Today it's longer. And I would see her once every 2 weeks. I would record the sessions so I could listen to it during the 2 weeks until the next session. I did that for 6 months. To sum up what I achieved in those 6 months is, my complaint was I don't feel normal. I feel imbalanced. I feel like half of myself was sliced off. How do I continue not being able to walk a straight line? And the message that I got was, what you're experiencing, this abnormality that you're experiencing is your new normal, and you have to learn how to adjust to the new normal. Not an easy thing to swallow, not an easy thing to adjust to, but I did my very best. That went on for a while. A year passed, 2 years passed, and God, in his kindness, brought my sister earlier to visit me. She lived in Yerushalayim. She came to visit me to check on her brother. And we went out to Catalina Island, if you know California, for a day, no distractions. And she was, actually my sister, Nechama Glassman, Aleha Shalom, taught at the earlier building, but she had a regular weekly class that she gave here for a number of years. And many people still remember her classes. Anyway, I thought my sister was just coming to visit me because of me, but I found out later, like everybody else, she had an agenda. And the agenda was to find out if and when I'm going to be open to remarry. And she didn't tell me, but Chana Rachel was sitting there in the back, was the agenda. She knew Chana Rachel well from Yerushalayim. She was teaching in Michlala and was looking desperately for Mr. Right. And apparently, in all of Eretz Yisrael, he wasn't there. And he wasn't hiding out in Long Beach, California. And apparently, in God's inimitable wisdom, her Bashert was taken at that time. But when the opening presented itself, the Eibishter brought us together, and we are 36 years into our happily ever after. But we realized when A normal couple gets married, they have about a year that they have no distractions. That's how it is. After a year, if they're blessed, there's a distraction, keeps you up at night. I say, only half in jest, I haven't had a good night's sleep since my oldest son, Shalom Yeshayahu, was born, and that was 51 years ago. But she jumped from Yerushalayim right into the fire, becoming a mother to 11 children. All right, one was, she was the mother to the 11th, who was in New York then, but she had to take responsibility, and she learned a crash course in wifehood and motherhood and taking care of a house and a home. And there was almost no time, private time, that couples need. So after, it was 2 years after we were married, or 3 years, I don't remember exactly, we said, okay, time's up, we gotta go away just by ourselves. We farmed out the kids, some went to camp, some went to live with relatives for a few weeks. So for some, we got babysitters to stay with them at home. We went to Yerushalayim, Ir HaKodesh, we stayed in the old city, and were able to breathe deeply without distraction. One of those days, we were walking in, right off the parking lot on the back of the old city, where the bus stop is. There's a little quiet area. There's a building called Rothschild's. It was a
Rothschild Square.
Rothschild Square. He built a building there, who knows how long ago. Right now it's a yeshiva. And it's 11 o'clock in the morning, and she says to me, Gershon, how are you? I thought that odd. We had been talking for the last 2 or 3 hours. All of a sudden, how are you? I said, I'm fine, Baruch Hashem. But she's a wise woman, and she looked me in the eyes and said, Gershon, how are you really? And that really started something that I couldn't control. I turned pale, I got dizzy, and you know that phrase, your life flashes before you? Well, not my entire life, but just the period from the time my first wife passed away until that moment, it flashed by me in a flash. And I knew that I'm in trouble, and I need to do something about it. And I knew, and somehow it was related to this period. I thought everything was fine. I thought I was happy. I thought things were good. But fortunately, we were able to find a therapist that I knew. I didn't know her professionally, but I knew of her as a friend of a friend who had made Aliyah and was in Yerushalayim. Called her up and see if she would take me on, and she did. And for the next 10 days, I think every second weekday, I spent some time with her, and she explored and probed and opened me up to the realization that, to my own surprise, I had a grudge against God. I'm an Orthodox Jew. I put on 2 pairs of tefillin every day since my 18th birthday. I'm a Lubavitcher Chassid. I'm a shliach from the Lubavitcher Rebbe. Es passt nicht. It's not appropriate to be angry at God. Bad people are angry at God, not good people. But I found out that I was angry at God. Now, just the fact that you open the locked door and you let sunlight and air get in, that is the beginning of the healing. And that's what happened during those 10 days. Just being able to identify what was the stress that I was suppressing and didn't want to admit, that itself was the beginning of the healing. And after that, it took a little while. I couldn't stay in Yerushalayim for much longer, but we worked it out. I worked it out with Hashem after that to return our relationship to what it was before all this began. Or as I like to say, my mind was at peace with Hashem all the time, but my heart had a mind of its own, and it wasn't at peace until after that. So, in answer to the question, why did I write this book? I took the course. It was a difficult course, and I paid a heavy tuition to learn this course. And I didn't find a book that speaks to the heart of the issue to a person who is actually struggling with tragedy, with loss. And sometimes that loss, in my case, it was having a grudge against Hashem. For others, it's reaching a point that they don't want to have anything to do with Hashem, or even want to renounce that there is even Hashem in charge of the world. So I figured if I took the course, paid the tuition, got the education, I should present it to people who might have the same issue, and they can get to their solution sooner. And that was a nice idea. By that time it was 1989, 1990, but I still had 11 children to raise with Chana Rachel's help, or I should say, Chana Rachel was raising our 11 children with my help when I was available. That's how husbands are, you know. And I still had a school to take care of, so it took a long time till I could actually get down to writing the book. For all those years until about 3 or 4 years ago, I was collecting notes, making notes, keeping notes on my computer. I had a box of newspaper clippings and different photo sets from different places. And finally, about 2 or 3 years ago, I said, I got to do it. And Lo Yachshav Emosai, and that's how the book came into being. Yidden are called Yisrael. Yisrael means those who wrestle with Hashem. Challenging Hashem and having full faith in Hashem are not inconsistent. Avraham challenged Hashem, Chalilu l'cha shefet kol aretz lo yaseh mishpat b'Sdom. Moshe Rabbeinu challenged Hashem, Lo mahari yosa la'am hazeh. David HaMelech, Keli, Keli, Lama Azavtani, Why God, Why, is based on the pasuk, Keli, Keli, Lama Azavtani. Yirmiyah, Madua Derech Rishayim Tzolech, I think in Eretz Yisrael, when I give this talk in the United States, I have to translate everything. I hope here most of the people get the references. And for sure, Eov complained to God. And the ultimate answer in the book of Eov was not an answer to the question, why did it happen? None of these great prophets got direct answers. Eov's answer, spelled out in 2 eloquent, poetic chapters towards the end of Eov, is God is talking about himself. I'm not going to even attempt the poetry, which is so beautiful. You could look it up there in chapter 41 and 42. But I am the creator, you are the creature. I created the universe. I created time and space. I created the values of good and evil. And how can you, just as we, mere mortals, as much as we might try to understand beyond time and space, we can try, but it's not going to get us anywhere. We have no frame of reference for it. Likewise, we don't have a frame of reference for Hashem's judgment. When Moshe Rabbeinu saw Rabbi Akiva's body being flayed by the Romans, and he cried out to God, Zoi Torah v'zoi schara, is this the reward for Rabbi Akiva? God didn't say, he said, Shtoik, be silent, kachalav b'machshava. So it is high up in my mind, beyond your ability to understand. We need to understand that not being able to understand God's way is not because we are too small, but God is inherently beyond our understanding. He is the creator of understanding. Therefore, it would be impossible for us to try to understand him. But he chose to contort himself, to squeeze himself into I'll use the word anthropomorphic. He took on the human image in the sense that Hashem kel racham v'chanun, ato gibor le'olam Hashem, where we attribute to Hashem values so that we can relate to him. And he did put himself into that form, but that doesn't exhaust who he is. It's just his persona so that he can relate to us. None of these Nevi'im lost any faith when they challenged Hashem. In fact, their challenge to Hashem was an outgrowth and an outburst of their faith in Hashem, because they believed in Hashem so to their core, and when they saw something which they couldn't square with their perception of Hashem, Kel Racham V'Chanun, they complained, saying, God, you are so real and so true, how is it that what we are experiencing doesn't comport with our image of you which you taught us? So the question was reinforcing their faith rather than weakening their faith. I have a niece. She's a shlucha in Hanover, Germany. Her mother-in-law, lives in Malachi Nachlas HaChabad. We just spent the Shabbos before this, just as we came here, we spent the Shabbos with her mother-in-law. So this young lady, Sterny Wolf, married to my sister's son, Benny. After 5 years of doing shlichus in Russia, they had reached the point that they felt that they could take on a shlichus of their own, and they went to Hanover, Germany, which dealt with Russian immigrants. That's my reminder that I shouldn't speak for a full hour. And they opened a shlichus for people who knew so little about their Jewishness, but when the flintstone is struck correctly, sparks fly, and 8 years later they had a real community of more than 100 families that were getting close. They have, besides putting on tefillin and teaching people about kashrus, they have a project that we don't do that much in the States, and that is, have you had a bris lately? Don't laugh. It's not only 5 and 10 and 15-year-old kids that didn't have brises. Sometimes their fathers and grandfathers didn't either. But they knew that they're Jewish, and that was part of the tradition which they never had. And lo and behold, when they choose to have a bris, it is a simcha. There was a bar mitzvah. My sister just told me there was a boy who never had a bar mitzvah. They made a bar mitzvah for him, and he said he wants to undertake something, and he decided himself he wants to have a bris. They brought in a oil, and the grandfather who came to celebrate his grandson's bar mitzvah said, and me too. And we won't go into all the details, but that's how it happens there. So she was interviewed by Ami magazine about 2 years ago about, Benny, at the beginning of COVID, came down with COVID. He was spent Pesach, was that 3 years ago, in the hospital, and went into a coma, and 3 weeks later he didn't wake up. And Shtarny said, I'm going to keep going. She's an Israeli, I'm not going back to Eretz Yisrael. We undertook this shlichus for life. We undertook it together. I'm sorry he's not here, but he would want me to continue this. The Rebbe would want me to continue this, so I'm here. And she is there keeping the fire alive in her home. Just last week, her second daughter got engaged. She is made out of not steel but titanium, and she's doing it. Oh, that wasn't mine. And Ami magazine asked her, after probing into all the details of her husband's passing 3.25 years ago, do you have any questions on God? And she's a very straight shooter. She says, questions? Wouldn't you have questions? Sure I have questions, but I have no doubts. And that is ultimately the Jewish answer. We have to be honest with ourselves. If we were figuratively the famous Reb Zusha, who didn't see that he had any tsaros, then everything is fine. But if you're not Reb Zusha, don't deny what's going on, and if it's difficult for you to square the circle, don't have doubts on God, but you have questions. And if you can figure out the question tomorrow, or 20 years from now, and looking back on your life and you have some insight, or you might have to wait until Mashiach comes, or until you get to the cross of the big divide and you get to Gan Eden, you'll figure it out somewhere. Hashem is in charge. We don't always understand him, but he is always right. But I'll elaborate on that shortly. I have a son in Atlanta. If you ever go to Atlanta and you're looking for a good place to go on Shabbos, Chabad in town, by the, what's the name of that thing around the city?
Peachtree?
No, not Peachtree. It's a road, a walking road, takes around a big portion of the city, and his Chabad is right on that. I forgot the name. Anyway, this was about 13 years ago, and we came there for a simcha, and my son says, Tati, when it quiets down at night, can we go out and talk? I said, sure. We go out, and he is angry. Thank God not at me. But who is he angry at? He's angry at Hashem. He has a first cousin who was a little younger than him, who was in the late stage of lung cancer. And he was a shliach in West Virginia. And even though he fought valiantly and optimistically, full of faith, he was losing the battle. And my son was asking, why? Wife, 4 kids, young family, dedicated to serving Hashem. Why is this happening? And I thought, smart guy that I am, I'm a rabbi. I know the answers. Been through this. I'll explain it to him. And when he finishes his presentation, I realized he's a rabbi too. He was in his late 30s at that point. People ask him the same question. He is a Talmud Chacham, a kind person, and very knowledgeable. What am I going to say to him that he doesn't already know? So I said to him, Eliyahu, do you want an answer or do you want a hug? And he looked at me, his eyes filled up with tears, and he said, I want a hug. And I gave him a hug like I hadn't given him since he was a kid. We count what people experience when they experience a tragedy is they are in pain, and a pain that they don't know how to deal with. And they fool themselves into thinking, if I can have an answer to this question, the pain would go away. But that wouldn't work, because the pain is not coming from the mind, the pain is coming from the heart. Or even deeper than the heart, the pain is coming from the person's core, from his kishkis. And an intellectual answer, as wonderful and powerful as it might be, won't answer it, won't address it. But a hug does a much better job of restoring the person's and solving one's pain than an answer does. And as Rabbi Jonathan Sachs says, when something of that magnitude happens, we don't really think, even the person asking the question doesn't think, now I'm going to get the answer. We all intuitively know that there isn't a good answer that will answer that question. So Rabbi Sachs says the question really is not why, the question is what. What are we supposed to do now? What is our challenge now? In most instances, it is to find solutions for others that might be going through it without having a clear answer to the question. So, if you're a non-believer and you don't have answers, and you are truly faithful and you don't have answers, what's the difference? The difference is the difference from day and night. If there is no God and tragedies happen and you write it off as bad luck, then you are a victim. You can struggle with your victimhood, or you can embrace your victimhood. And today, last years, victimhood is a growth industry. You can monetize it, you can be proud of it, and at the end, you might be a wealthy, proud victim. Or you can be a Jew who believes in Hashem, says, Hashem, whom I don't understand, there are parts of why am I going through this, I don't know, but I trust in Hashem that it serves a purpose. Maybe one day I will even be able to identify with that which I've learned in Sfarim, that it is ultimately good. I don't experience it that now. I don't experience it that way now. But at this moment, I know that it is purposeful. I know that it is meaningful. And Hashem is giving me a vote of confidence that I can handle this. I can grow from this and somehow become a better person. So I am not a victim. I have agency. I have the ability to take responsibility for my life. I am the captain of my ship and the master of my destiny, and it's Hashem whom I worship. Klal Yisrael has been going through 2,000 years of tragedies, and how do we deal with it? The very same way. The kinnis that we're going to be saying next Thursday is full of complaints against Hashem, and at the same time, as we say in Tachanun, different customs say it Monday and Thursday, some may say it at different times. We are the beating tool of all the nations for the last 2,000 years. Nevertheless, we didn't forget you, Hashem, don't forget us. In our less dramatic than the Jews who walked into the crematoria singing an imamin, but we need to reassert for ourselves that Hashem runs the world, and He is a Father in heaven and a Mother in heaven who cares for us, and we need to embrace Him, and He will, and we have to ask for Mashiach, because that's when ultimately this will be fully resolved. And I'll just finish with a little example that I relate to. Now, as you look at me, how many of you would say that I am a surfer?
Surfer.
A surfer. One who surfs on the ocean.
On the internet or on the ocean?
On the ocean. I am not a surfer. I can barely swim. But I like to watch surfing, and I like the way they go up and down and under and over. And about 2 years ago, while I was writing the book, my wife and I went to Coronado Island, not far from Los Angeles. We watched the surfers, and I was seeing these guys come down, and there's a big wave coming, and they dive into the wave. And I called the surfing school, which was advertising in the little place that we stayed, and I said, what's that called when they jump into the wave? It says they get into the bottom of the wave. It's called duck diving. I don't know if it's because they duck like a duck, or they duck because they duck. I don't know if it's a verb or a noun, but it's called duck diving. Life's waves come on us inexorably, whether we like it or not. It's going to hit you. I hope few times in your life, and I hope they won't be devastating. But if you don't know how to surf and you just sit there like a deer in the headlight, staring at the headlights, and the wave hits you, it can devastate you. It can kill a person. But if you're a good surfer, you go to the core of the wave, you duck into its core, and then you swim underneath it where there's no kinetic energy or very little, and you swim and you come out on the top and you ride the wave again on top of the wave to shore with great exhilaration. Life gives us tzaras. If we could identify that Hashem, now this very same Hashem that is the source of the tzara, we do not deny that, and yet that is from some transcendent aspect of Hashem. That same Hashem who comes down to us says, Imei anechi b'tzara, I am with you in your travail, in your suffering, I'm there with you. And when you go through a tragedy, you are very vulnerable. You're very open. If you don't, that openness can lead people astray to alcoholism and drug addiction and other tzaras, which for normal people who are strong, but that tragedy made them very vulnerable. And for us, the vulnerability is to re-embrace Hashem, who is with us all along, wants to be with us, wants us to be open with Him. He wants us to give Him a prominent place in your home all the time. He wants to move in with us. He really does. He doesn't want to be a guest once in a while. Friday night, you'll acknowledge him on Pesach and Hanukkah. He wants to move in, and he wants to be our friend. We should embrace him. Thank you.
Which Chabad yeshiva did you learn before you were married?
Bedford and Dean.
Where?
Bedford and Dean.
Bedford
Stuyvesant, yeah. Good old Bedford Stuyvesant.
Okay. First of all, I want to thank Rabbi Schusterman for his inspiring words. Rabbi, do you have time for a few questions?
Sure.
We'll take, let's say, 5 minutes for a few questions. At 9 o'clock, we'll have the opportunity for those who want to purchase a book to purchase the book, and maybe stick around so Rabbi Schusterman will also sign books if you like. But at 9 o'clock also, I'd ask the men if we could gather over here to make a Ma'ariv minyan, okay, for a few minutes, okay.
Okay, do we have any questions? Yeah.
So you were saying that the impetus for writing the book was the fact that the existing books kind of sparring on the market were really intellectual and not. So the question I have is there really, I'll call it a conceptual framework when you're dealing with emotions from the heart? Is there almost like a step-by-step, because we're dealing with emotions, we're dealing with heart-sick stuff. I know you're giving like little kind of bits and pieces of advice, but is there, because something from the heart is not necessarily so linear like something intellectual that you wouldn't read a sefer, is there really an avoda that has 4 corners, so to speak, and steps to dealing with this kind of stuff?
Not as neat as you presented 4 steps, but yes, first of all, besides emunah, there are quite a number of explanations for tzoros. I'll start with the classic, which we all know. He who sees Yisurim coming on him, Yefashvish b'maisav, should explore and examine his deeds. In other words, it might be, and I'll say it 2 ways, it's either punishment, or it's encouragement, or it's challenging your testing your faith. I don't, for one's own self, a person's allowed to yefashvish b'maisav, ask himself, maybe I brought this on myself. For another person, it is a din in Shulchan Aruch that you're not allowed to cast that kind of aspersion, even for a person whom you know is not a tzaddik. And I talk about that in the book in stages. But there's a difference between little problems and tragedies. Tragedies are those that are overwhelming and there's no frame of reference for it. And again, I'm not trying to, the book goes through many stages and many phases with many anecdotes, both personal and from other people, which give word and a framework how other people have interpreted that for themselves. The example that I gave from my niece in Hanover, I have many questions, but I haven't no doubts. That is a simple anecdote, but it speaks volumes of faith and living with your questions. Rabbi Sachs has a lot about that in his writings also, that you can have doubt and faith simultaneously. It's a continuum. Every religion has its paradoxes, and ultimately you submit that there's more to God than that you can understand. But you have to go through the steps one by one so that you grow with it. And I do my best in the book to go through those stages. But it's not a linear, week 1, week 2. But if you read the book, I think you'll understand what I'm saying. Good. Yes?
So I lost my husband a month and a half ago. Everybody's telling me, now you have to look inside. Till now, we were married almost 50 years. Till now, you traveled together, you were a couple, now you have to really go inside and find out who you are. Well, so the other thing is I don't feel I need therapy, but you went to 2 therapists. My therapists are my friends, people I know. I surround myself with most foreign. So I am so emotional. I wasn't going to ask a question, but I feel that, do you feel therapy helped you?
In my case, I have no doubt that it helped me. And I'm not saying that everybody needs therapy. I didn't mean to imply that.
No.
I would say the opposite. When I first, before I did the book, I did some podcasts, and my daughter-in-law, different daughter-in-law, challenged me on a podcast, which is not like writing. You can't edit it. When you're asked a tough question, you got to answer, or, oh man. And she asked me questions of this nature, and I talked about, first time I talked publicly about that I've been to therapy once and twice, and I felt so bad after that hour, that session. I thought it was a big mistake that I didn't hear the questions first. It was a big mistake that I even answered, yeah, I'll do this podcast for you. The next 2 weeks, I got so many calls from Lubavitcher Hasidim. My father's such a chashuv rabbi, and we lost our mother 20 years ago, and we really needed therapy. And our father said, therapy is for Goyim. So we never went to therapy. If you went to therapy, we can go to therapy. We're going to go to therapy. I excuse the expression, spilled my guts in the book, so to give other people permission to do the same. But it doesn't necessarily mean that everybody needs therapy. And you know what? As far as I'm concerned, a good, kind Rav, a good, wise Rebbitzin, a good, mature friend who has the wisdom of life is the therapist without the degree. I'm not saying you need a therapist. You need a friend. If you can do it with saying Tillim to Hashem and feel Hashem in the Tillim, that's the best therapist.
Thank you.
Yep.
I was an orphan at the age of 7 months. My father was the principal of the school, and he had 6 children, orphans to take care of, and he also had to tackle with it. One of the things that he taught us was mind over matter. He also taught us the pasuk that in Mishlei that Shlomo HaMelech says, "Da'aga b'levish," a person has a worry, yisachen al speak it out to others, it can mean, or yisachen al can mean daven for others. I think that Bnei Yissaschar maybe says this pshat, that you daven for others, like it's l'suach l'sada. So when a person has a problem, sometimes by getting busy with, like you said, helping others, trying to help them out, is a therapy in and of itself.
And the reality is, no 2 people are alike. And, at best, we can point out some general approaches, but it has to fit the person. There are a lot of great therapists, but a therapist is like a shidduch. Great men, great women, but if they're not a shidduch, they're not a shidduch. Even therapists have to be the right shidduch for the person who needs the support. But as I said before, if a person doesn't need it, kol hakavod, and it doesn't have to be in the form of psychotherapy. Okay.
One more question.
Okay.
I wanted to ask, it seems that you told the story about your son, and he just needed a hug. So my assumption is that a lot of people just need hugs. How do you get a hug?
Shlomo HaMelech says in Mishlei, the chol, I'm going to try to do it in Ivrit, I speak Lashon Kodesh, I don't speak. B'chol et ehov hareya v'ach letzara yivali. At all times, love a friend, and a brother will be born or will blossom in a time of tzara. A person has to be mu'urvim abrius, he has to have friends to whom he relates to, and when there is a crisis, you can't go out into the street and say, I need a friend now, anybody available? It doesn't work that way. You have to have a previous friend. And the Gemara says, who is the Reya in Mishlei? There's many references to the Reya. And the Gemara says, Reya is HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The best therapist and the best Reya and the best friend is Hashem. But sometimes you need a Mashpia and a Rav and a Rebbetzin to bridge the gap between the friend in heaven and us on earth. But it's there. It's all in Torah. Okay. Rav Meir, thank you for listening. Books are in the back for those who are interested.
Rav Meir will be here. This session.